This is the second video in solving rational equations, lesson 4. You were supposed to do A, which was you try. I got x equals negative 29. The restriction is x equals negative 4. Cannot be negative 4, so this is a legitimate solution. We're going to do a little more complicated. There's no one way to solve a rational equation. You just have to think, first of all, is it a proportion? If it is, great, I can cross multiply, but I might benefit from simplifying first. If it's not a proportion, which is like this case because I have x squared minus a rational expression, I want to possibly simplify first, and I'm going to do that. I know the numerator factors to x minus 2, x plus 2, and that way I can factor out the x minus 2. Remember, when you factor out something in the denominator, you got to be sure that you write the restriction before it's gone. That should actually be x cannot be positive 2. So that's your restriction. So now we're left with x squared minus x plus 2. And notice I have to distribute in that minus, which is a common mistake that people make. I'm going to move everything to one side because it's a quadratic by subtracting 4. Remember how I told you have to try to factor a quadratic? A lot of times that's the easiest way to solve it. You could also use the quadratic formula, or you could use your graphing calculator. But if you don't have a graphing calculator, this is the way to go. So there's two solutions for this one. X could be 3 or x could be negative 2. And neither of those meet the restriction, so those are legitimate solutions. Going over to the next page, you're going to do B and C, I believe. Yep. And I'm going to quickly roll through A. I have a proportion here, so I could easily cross multiply if I put this over 1. But I can see these are quadratics, and I'm going to factor them. The numerator has a greatest common factor of 4, so I'm going to pull that out. And then I can factor the quadratic left over, which is 4 times x minus 3x plus 1. Notice the 4 is still there. It doesn't just disappear. The denominator I'll do in red. That factors to x minus 3, x plus 2. We did that on the other page, and this is equal to 3 over 1. So our two restrictions is x cannot be 3 and negative 2 because that's what the denominator values would make the denominator 0. So I'm going to cross this out. I'm left with 4 times x plus 1 over x plus 2, which equals 3 over 1. So now I have a proportion, so I can cross multiply. I'm going to do 4 times x plus 1 times 1, and then I'm going to do 3 times x plus 2. And I do need to use the distributive property. And then I will solve. So I get 4x plus 4 equals 3x plus 6. I'm running out of room here. 3x will go. I'll get x on this side. This will go. I'll get positive 2 on the right side. Just double check that that is not an extraneous solution. It's not. Good to go. All right, moving on to D. D, again, I don't have a proportion. I'm going to try to factor. If I have a leading coefficient of a negative, it might be helpful if I factor out a negative. So these have a GCF of 2, but if I pull out a negative 2, I get x minus 2, which is extremely helpful because the denominator is x minus 2. And the right-hand side is 3 times x plus 1. Notice I'm putting my expressions in parentheses. That's going to go. But remember your restrictions, what values your denominator cannot be, your x values cannot be, 2 and negative 1. So I am left with negative 2 over equals 3 over x plus 1 minus 1. Well, I have a constant here and a constant here, so I'm just going to add 1 and get it over to the left side. Negative 1 equals 3 times over x plus 1. Now I'm going to cross multiply, so I'm going to do negative 1 times x plus 1, and that's equal to 3. Distribute in, negative x minus 1 equals 3. I get negative x equals 4. And then I get x equals negative 4. So there is my solution. So you try the others and answer your questions next class. Thanks.